Hello, everyone. We're just going to give people a few minutes to get in tonight. While you're joining us, you'll see a welcome poll. It helps us tailor the conversation to know who's in the room. So please just take a minute or two and let us know. We are very excited that you're here. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. We had almost 1,000 people registered tonight, so it's just going to take a minute to get everyone into the room. As you come in, you'll see a welcome poll. It helps us to know who's in the room so we can tailor the conversation accordingly. So please just take a minute or two, let us know. We'll get started in another 60 seconds. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Natalie Gallagher. I'm president of Guidewell Education, and whatever brand you're joining us from tonight, whether you're here from Appleruth or Summit or ESM or somewhere else, we are excited to have you. So please, this is supposed to be a dynamic conversation. Please submit your questions. Use the Q&A function, not chat. Chat won't be visible to Paul and Rick, but they will be able to see the Q&A. So please put your questions there. And if you missed something or you have to hop off early or you're worried, you didn't get to take notes about that question that you were burning to get the answer to, don't worry, we will be sharing the recording in the coming days. So don't stress about that. I have the absolute honor of introducing our speakers tonight. So Rick and Paul are two superstars in the world of college admissions. Together, they have more than 60 years of combined experience and have probably been quoted in just about every major publication that has ever covered college admissions in any way whatsoever. So our moderator for tonight's discussion is Paul Kanarek, who is just an absolute expert and a joy, as you will hear when he moderates the discussion. He's globally recognized expert in college admissions and high-stakes testing. He founded the Princeton Review in California in 1983 and later became CEO of Collegewise in 2015. Paul has appeared on multiple television shows, spoken about U.S. college admissions all over the globe. He's renowned for his lively, insightful, and inspiring talks. And if you haven't had the privilege of hearing him speak before, I have no doubt that you will soon see why he has earned that reputation. And similarly, not to be outdone, our expert tonight is Rick Clark, who currently serves as the Executive Director of Strategic Student Access at Georgia Tech. I think I got that right, Rick. He is co-author of, I'll show you his book here. He's co-author of The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to getting in and staying together. And he also leads a podcast by the same name, and they have a workbook as well. So lots of great resources that he's helped put out in the world. Rick has been at Georgia Tech for more than 20 years. He was director of undergraduate admission until 2022. He also has worked in admissions at a number of other places that you have likely heard of, including Georgia State and Wake Forest. And he served on a number of national advisory and governing boards for higher education at the state, regional, and national levels. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much.
It's a delight. And since I get to moderate, I get to go first. And so I'll just tell Rick and this audience, this is a big time fangirl moment for me. Sort of like there are certain voices in our space where you just look and say, he said that perfectly, far better than I ever could. And I'm just going to send it to everyone that I know. And Rick has been that voice for me on dozens and dozens of occasions. And it's very rare I get to sort of share a similar space with him. And so this is a fireside chat that doesn't actually involve a fire or us being side by side, but there will be a chat construct. And, every chat begins with the initial question. And Rick, for you, we got to know, why do you do this work?
Yeah, well, first of all, Paul, thanks so much for, the opportunity. I'm also looking forward to our chat, and it's good to be with you. I think the last time we were actually in person, unless you can think of another time, was on Georgia Tech's campus, probably, gosh, 15-ish years ago. So a pleasure. Why do I do this work? I mean, I think first and foremost, I just genuinely believe in college as a transformative time in students' lives. And the ability for institutions to have a great impact on their community and the world at large. I think beyond that, what I've seen in my time at Georgia Tech specifically is this increased anxiety or stress that students and families sometimes feel around college admission. And so why I have, gone beyond just the actual role and the job into the book and the podcast and some of these others is, we've both seen it go so well for some families in terms of instead of it being a divisive type of experience, it's actually a uniting experience. Instead of it bringing, stress or anxiety, actually a lot of joy and opportunity and discovery. And so because there's models out there and because there's ways that people can approach this to where it can actually bring families together and be a really excellent opportunity. That's why I do a lot of this work and why I'm excited about our conversation tonight.
That's a very fair answer. I mean, you and I both believe that this is a journey. It's not a process.
Right.
Process is like a bank loan. No one gets excited about a bank loan. But a journey is joyful because you get to go somewhere. And there's things that go wrong in journeys. I've had bags get lost, airline
Sure.
flights get canceled, really bad things happen in hotel rooms. But ultimately, you're going to end up in a cool and exciting place. Um,
Mhm.
One of the things that I really like about the ethos that you evolved at Georgia Tech is you would tell the Georgia Tech story as Georgia Tech story. In other words, you didn't try to be all things to all people. You didn't sort of say, we're going to try and check every box in our communications.
Mhm.
Now, you went in a different direction from most other universities. Most other universities tried to be all things to all people.
Mhm.
Why did you do it? And has it worked?
Why did we do it? It's just true. I mean, fundamentally, we are not. Georgia Tech has 39 majors. We don't have 140 like some, flagship and large institutions. We are, very lean in the academic side of things. And fundamentally, it's just not the right place for every student, but it is an amazing place for many students. And so our culture is different. Our culture is unique, and telling that story, has been a real privilege. Has it worked? I would say yes. I do think that Georgia Tech has been able to establish itself, not only in our state but in the country and really internationally as well, as a place that has a real amazing mission and an ability to not only transform student lives, but then send students out to improve the businesses they're in, the communities they're in, the families they're in. And so I think that that's, really been a big piece of it is, you know, we're not all fine things to all people. And so it's just fundamentally true. But the story we have to tell and the opportunity that we have to tell is one that distinguishes us. And for the right student, I think that's also like just ethically the right thing to do because we want students to know exactly who we are and why it would be a good fit for them.
There's a YouTube video gang. I think it is a sophomore at
Okay.
Georgia Tech welcoming freshmen to the school.
Hmm.
It's one of the most remarkably authentic and beautiful things I've ever seen. And what makes it magnificent is it truly articulates who and what Georgia Tech is.
Mm,
And when you see that voice, you'll have one of two reactions, like Earth Mama, I am home, or you'll run screaming into the night. And that's what we would love to see more colleges lay out there. And in
right.
reverse, it's also why Rick and I constantly advise you as students to find your own voice in your essays. The
Mm.
more real and authentic you are, the easier it is for the people in admissions to sort of say, you're going to be happy and you're going to fit here. I notice we have our first question in the Q&A box. I want to honor it. And it's just someone sort of thanking you for the work that you have done on your podcast. So
Oh, that's
there you
great.
go. You got a second fan.
Hey, very good. It's not just my mom listening. Good to know.
Um, every now and again, gang, I'm going to stop. I'm going to scan the Q&A. I'm going to sort of bring things into the dialogue because we want to interweave sort of your thoughts and your questions in. And to that point, if by the time people leave here, Rick, you have inculcated one thing in their brain, you have left them with sort of one takeaway, what's that thing going to be for Mr. Clark today?
I think the biggest thing is that a lot of people, students and parents, have a little bit of the end in mind. Maybe that's a certain bumper sticker, a certain diploma. And what I would love to see people, and so success or winning or where this is all headed is sometimes a very specific destination and place. Back to your analogy of a journey, instead of it being, ending up at a certain place per se, I really think that the goal for parents, the goal for families, the goal for students instead is ultimately to have choices and options, and that to me is what winning is. I think that if you talk to seniors as they're finishing and graduating from high school, if you talk to freshmen in college, a lot of times it wasn't, I ended up at my dream school. It all went the way I thought it was going to. I scripted this out to your point of a process, right? Of a recipe, and I just followed X plus Y to Z. But instead, like, I got to sit down and choose where I wanted to go. And some things got taken away, right? Sure. There were a couple of places that I didn't have an option to go because the school said no to that, or we couldn't afford that, or some other reason. But in the end, I had choices and I had options, and there was a lot of freedom in that, a lot of power in that, and a lot of excitement in that. And I teach a freshman class here at Georgia Tech, and of that class, a third of them said that Georgia Tech was their first choice. Two-thirds then was not. But now we're getting towards the end of the semester and they're all living on campus, they're friends, they're excited. Half of them have become tour guides. I mean, they have not only drank the Kool-Aid, they're selling the Kool-Aid. And I think that that's what I hope people will understand is, choices and options is the goal, not a definitive place.
First, hallelujah. Secondly, Natalie, there's a request to put that link from the YouTube video into the chat. Since I can't access chat, it would be great if you could do that.
I will do my
Third,
best.
thirdly, I want to echo that optionality is everything. And fourthly, I want to share something with parents and students. So I've been doing this a long, long time. And back in the 80s, when pterodactyls roamed the globe, I began to ask my students a simple question. Did you get accepted into one of your top 5 choices for college? And back, I think the first time I did that was like 1986. And about 90% of my kids in 1986 said, yeah, they had been accepted into one of their top 5 choices for college. Well, last year I did it again. So we're sort of 40 years later in an ecosystem that feels much harsher. I asked the same question. Did you get into one of your top 5 choices for college? And you know what? More than 90% it was yes.
Hmm.
So Rick and I can look you in the virtual eye and tell you, not only are you going to get to go to college, but almost certainly you're going to get to go to one of your top 5 choices. And that's a magical thing to remember. And that's the takeaway I wanted to have for you. Anything you want to
Mhm.
add there, Rick?
Well, I mean, statistically, that's also accurate. I mean, if you look at the average admit rate for four-year schools in the country over the last 5 years, it's gone up 7 percentage points. The likelihood is that will continue. That the average admit rate will continue to go up. Most schools admit most students by far. So right now it's about a 67% admit rate, and it had been around the 60% rate, pre-pandemic. And that's going to continue to go up because, there's a lot of things happening both domestically and internationally that are shrinking the top of the funnel, right? The number of students who are applying and ultimately, going to college. It's not going to change the admit rate for some schools, right? So that's true. But I do think that, yes, that's an important point, is that if you do your job, if you have a balanced list of schools, if you get excited about a number of places, you're going to end up having some really great choices and options. And I guess too, like, I mean, as a parent in particular, that's what we always want for our kids. I mean, whether they're 5 years old or 50 years old, we want them to not have to do things, but to get to do things. We want them to be able to choose where they go to college, but they also want to get to choose what job they take or who they marry or where they live, right? And so I think that if parents can sort of back map that or load that into the way they're approaching this, it can take a little pressure off of, I need to do everything I can to help them get here, to I need to set them up for having, a variety of choices and options, and then just support how it plays out.
It's fascinating because you've predicted a bunch of the questions that are going
Okay.
in the Q&A. Like, what do I do in the summer? What are the best extracurricular activities? And I want you guys to know those are not the kinds of questions we're going to answer today. They're too mechanistic and individual. But here's one I really liked.
Okay.
And thank you, Peter, for this one. And it'll hit home for you because you have spent far too much of your life sitting behind tables in sweaty high school gyms.
Mm.
What are some questions that you think families should ask, either at those sessions or of the tour guides,
Mm-hmm.
to understand the culture and fit of a university? That's
Yeah,
a really interesting one. Take it away.
it's a good one. It's a good one. Well, first and foremost, I mean, one of my biggest pieces of advice is to figure out what your questions really are. So I'm happy to give a couple. But I think it's really important for students and families to determine like what really matters to them. Because here's something else I can tell you that I've done for too much of my life, and I've been on panels and been, friends with many admission people. And I can tell you this, if you just show up to an admission session or go on a tour, if you look closely, they all have this little string in the back of their back that they pull, and they just roll on the script. And they're just gonna talk and talk and talk, and they're gonna tell you all the party line, and they're gonna just give you the whole spiel. And if you don't interject and if you don't ask your questions, you're just gonna get what they give you. And so figuring out, like, if I'm taking the time and investing the money and going off of school or whenever we as a family might go visit these colleges, you need to, have full value out of that trip and out of that investment. And so I want to encourage people to really think about what matters to them and be very proactive about getting the answers to those questions. With that said, I think that, a couple of things is this idea of digging deeper into what you'll already typically hear. So as an example, a school will say, we have a retention rate of 90%. In other words, 9 out of every 10 of our students continue from first year to second year. I think a great question to ask as a follow-up to that is, well, why do students leave your institution? Because there's a lot of different reasons that 10% can leave. 10% can leave because, you don't have the major that they offer. 10% can leave because, they're not financially able to continue. 10% can leave for both really great reasons and reasons that will help you think about, what that school is doing to support students. Same thing with faculty student ratios. There's a lot of junk in those numbers. And so a school will say, oh, our faculty student ratio is 20-1. And in your mind, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to be sitting around with 19 other kids in every class, and that's going to be my experience at this school. Rarely is that true. You got people on sabbatical thrown into those numbers. You've got, people that are only teaching 4,000 level physics in that number. I think the better question to ask is, what is the faculty student ratio? What's the average class size for first year students? What's the average class size for people in my major? To get a better sense of this. So those are a couple like more into the numbers. The other thing I like to ask and encourage people to do is ask the same question to a number of different people. So if you ask a student, don't take their answer as gospel truth. Also ask a faculty member the same question. Also ask an alum the same question. You want to ask the same questions to as many people that are part of that as possible so you can triangulate on what's one person's divergent opinion and what is culture. So here's a good one. What has most surprised you about being here? What are you most excited about right now? And where do you kind of see that going in the years ahead? What has disappointed you, and what do you hope will change? No place is perfect. I mean, but I think about those questions in my experience at Georgia Tech. I think if you asked, what has surprised you, or what have you been really excited to think? I think a lot of students would say, you know, I thought Georgia Tech was going to be just like sort of whizzing buses and a bunch of concrete. And I've been surprised to see that, it is a place that's, kind of got a bunch of birds and squirrels and grass and trees, and it's college, right? Or they might talk about like the innovation and the accelerator work that's being done. That question works at so many different schools. And if you ask different people the same question, you can really start to hone in on what is true, what is culture, and whether that resonates with you or not. And I think that's a key part of exploring and discovering.
I would add two small things. The first is it's not bad to ask, what do you do for fun?
Mhm.
You can learn a lot about a school based upon how they enjoy themselves. And when Peter asked the question, he sort of put the word we around it. But what I find often happens is the parents move front and center on tours or at high school gymnasiums, and you really want the kid to be front and center. And you actually want to broaden that. You want to center everything in the student because it is their journey. You will have better outcomes. You will have better buy-in. And it just tends to be happier and sort of less nudgy when the kid is centered.
Mhm.
Someone mentioned, by the way, Rick, several people came in late, so I thought I'd give a brief précis. My name is Paul. I'm the former founder of Princeton Review, and I spent 40 years in the for-profit education space, guiding people around the world in college admissions. Rick is arguably the most famous voice in our space. He's a podcaster, he's an author. He rode herd on sort of one of the fastest growing universities in the land at Georgia Tech. And he really is sort of the voice of sensibleness throughout the industry. And that's sort of who we are. And we had a teacher just ask a question. Um, and the teacher says, look, I want to write great letters of rec for my kids.
Mhm.
I don't want to sort of do the McDonald's letter. What's a great letter of rec do when you're sitting and reading, Rick? Please answer that one.
So I'm going to answer that. I want to go back real quick on what you said about parents on tours and in the gym. If it's ever possible, and it isn't at every school, I understand this, to split up on tours, there's so much value in that to let the student go on one tour and parents go on the other. Because A, you hear and experience different things, and it gives you something to talk about when you leave. And I think that also allows the student to feel the freedom to ask questions or ask the parents to do the same, right? So there's a lot of value there. I love the question from the teacher about the rec. You know, I would say the biggest thing is, first of all, why do we have teacher recommendations? Why do we have counselor recommendations? Why are they even part of this whole review process? At the end of the day, the reason for that is it is one adult in a school community speaking to another adult in a school community. It's the only place on the application where another voice comes in. A transcript has no voice, test scores have no voice, a list of activities has no voice. At some point, a student gets to write or maybe do an interview, and there's a student voice. Complementary to all of that is a teacher or a counselor talking about who is this student in our community and who then might they be at yours. And that is invaluable because all the rest of it, you can imagine our applicant pool last year was 60,000. With your California connection, I mean, you're talking about UCLA at whatever absurd number that is now, 140 or something. So many students can be basically the same in the boxes and lines of the rest of the application. But that voice of an adult who's seen who that student is in the classroom, how they learn, how they contribute, how they interact, far more important than here's what is not a good teacher recommendation. first of all, they try to tell you all of why they're qualified. I've been teaching for 40 years and I've taught 3,000 students, and that is impressive, but really not helpful. What is helpful is, you know, that Paul was in my physics class, and when he isn't there, the conversation is less robust. And he is somebody who, asks questions that aren't necessarily gonna be on the test. It's not about what we just covered. It's about really exploring and learning more, right? Those type of insights are absolutely invaluable. And we don't need the grade, right? Best student in the class. We got that from the transcripts. We're looking for color. And I look at the application a lot like a drawing, where the rest of it is pretty black and white sketching. And then you start to get the essay and letters of recommendation, and you get it framed up and colored in. And that's what it's about.
I want to share something with the parents, because I want to give you an analogy that will resonate for you. You're hiring somebody for your company, right? So the very first question you're going to ask is, can they do the job? Do they have the skills, right? And that's called a resume. And that resume shows all of the talents, and you sort of go through it objectively, and you got like 6 potential candidates. Well, most of you, your next step is you meet them and you interview them. And invariably, you kind of hire the one you like, that you think fits your company. So you just move from the objective to the subjective. And right before you hire them, you check their references with previous employers. That's kind of life. Well, for those of us in admissions, it's not dramatically different. The first objective question is, are you smart enough to do the work here? Well, that's your high school transcript. That's objective. Then we move to the subjective. Is like, do we like you? Will you fit? That's your essays. That's your extracurricular activities. That's your voice. And then the third question is, do other people like you? And that's the function of the letters of recommendation. And so it's a deeply human journey, although so many of you hyper-focus on the objective piece. It's not irrelevant, but I mean, you had 60,000 applicants this year.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of them could you say, yes, they're smart enough to do the work?
So we've had this debate a lot, and I would put that number pushing 90%. We don't really get a lot of throwaway applications. This goes a little bit back to what you said earlier about Georgia Tech being not all things to all people. It is a very specific place, and it is a rigorous place, but most students who apply to Georgia Tech, they know what they're doing. They've done their homework, they've taken great classes, they're extremely capable. It's just a supply and demand issue. So that number for us, I think, is I mean, our admit rate this last year was 14%. But if it was not a space issue, I'd say that would be probably 6, 7x.
So one of our guests, Peter, has pushed back on this, and he's sort of going, well, how can you say that, right? It's sort of like, you've got 60,000 applicants.
Mm-hmm.
You proclaim the numbers don't matter, but how the heck are you going to holistically review 60,000 applicants? And the vocal intonations are designed to sort of give some context to the nature of the question. And I'd love you to put Peter's mind at ease and actually say, this is how we do it.
Well, I don't recall saying numbers don't matter. I just remember saying they all have good numbers.
Fair. Continue.
Well, I mean, when you look through these applications, yeah, it does start with, can the student, do the work, right? And most students answer that as yes. And so every school is going to put different priority within their process. I mean, as an example, for Georgia Tech, math progression is a big deal. Calculus is required, not for admission, but during your academic journey at Georgia Tech. So solid math courses, solid math choice and progression matters, right? And so that's something that we are going to index on. And other schools may do that a little less so, right? But if you just put this stuff on a spreadsheet and start drawing lines, that would just be one of the worst ways we could possibly make admission decisions for a variety of reasons. But when we talk about holistic, yeah, I mean, when you quickly get past the numbers being helpful, you do quickly start getting into, what did they do outside the classroom? I think about it in 3 I's: involvement, impact, and influence. right? And then all the other things. In other words, you got the numbers, and then admission people sort of, if they had an air bubble over their head in committee, would start saying, what else?
I wrote that down. Notice Rick didn't say title. Rick didn't say fame. Rick didn't sort of say, sexy this or that. What he said was involvement, impact, and influence. And those are three pretty powerful watchwords that will resonate almost at any campus that you're looking at. So, Sonia, when you sort of say what makes an essay stand out, it's your ability to articulate those three I's in a voice that is truly that of the kid, not a parent's edited voice, because we can smell the stench of dad's writing in 10 words. And for God's sake, we're actually smart enough to see when ChatGPT has written it for them. A kid sounds like a kid with a kid's voice. That's what we really, really look for. And now I get to take you into one of your least favorite topics, but is popping up all over the place.
Okay.
What is the Georgia Tech view around standardized testing? SAT, ACT, AP, IB? Fire away.
Well, I thought you were going to go towards athletics, so I'm happy to talk about testing. With testing, Georgia Tech is a public institution. A lot of people actually don't know that. I'm sure there's some people on the call tonight who may assume we're private. Apparently, there's a school in Boston that has a similar name to us, and they happen to be private. Something Institute of Technology. We just call that the Georgia Tech of Boston, but we are, as a public school, required by our system to ask students to send test scores. And so we're agnostic between the SAT and the ACT. It doesn't matter to us, but a score is required. And as a public, part of that is driven by the fact that we have a test component to our lottery-funded scholarship. So for all of our Georgia students, they're coming in typically with a Hope or Zell Miller scholarship, and a test score is required, and a certain test score is required to receive that scholarship. So, it kind of makes sense. And in the South in general, I mean, I remember talking with a number of folks during the pandemic and shortly thereafter about where is this whole testing landscape going. And some people may have heard or read some of Jeff Salingo's work, and I remember having a conversation with him, and he's like, "Well, California is test blind, and do you think the South will follow?" Or no, he said, "So goes California, so goes the rest of the country." And I said, "You clearly have never lived in the South." And it has proven to be true. Increasingly, Southern states have gone back to requiring tests. And certainly there's some other notable private institutions that have done the same. But for us, we do require tests.
To the person who asked whether the PSAT is acceptable for standardized test submission, it is not. It's SAT or ACT. Gang, there's over 2,500 universities and colleges in America. Somewhere between 30 and 40 of them mandate standardized testing, right? So the vast majority do not. And I think the best way for you to look at it as consumers is to realize that it is in many ways the equivalent of a powerful extracurricular activity. If you swim well, swim more, and talk about your influence and your impact and your involvement in swimming. If the same is true for theater, tread the boards. If you happen to be really good with bubbles, then I would absolutely flex around that. But here's news. Neurodiverse kids aren't great with bubbles. The standardized tests going to a non-standardized mind, that's almost sort of like intellectually abusive to self. And if you want to spend your time working with the local Hispanic society because that's a passion you have for, or working with children with autism, or playing your sport, or doing the things that you love the most, and not spending time on standardized testing, that's absolutely fine as well. And virtually every college in the land will not penalize you for it, right? So here it's different strokes for different folks. Back to you, Rick.
No, I mean, I think the testing landscape is noisy and it's messy and it's not uniform, and that's just the world we're in and we're going to continue to be in. You have two ways to choose to look at that. One, that's frustrating. I wish they were all the same. Why can't it be easier and more simple? We say that about a lot of things in life. The other way to look at it is this is not surprising. Even though colleges send you, glossy, shiny brochures that all look the same, and it's like the very predictable pictures of three kids under a tree with a professor, and kid overseas studying abroad, looking out over the ocean kind of thing, and they make themselves look the same. The truth is they're not. They're all extremely different. They have different missions. They have different goals. And that is a beautiful, amazing thing. That's actually one of the best things about higher education in America. And in addition to my work at Georgia Tech, I travel for the U.S. State Department over to embassies and consulates around the world. And I've come even more so to appreciate how weird but cool American higher education is in contrast to many of the other countries around the world. And I'm guessing with as many people as we have on tonight, there are people who did in fact go to college elsewhere and know that to be true. So not surprising. And we just embrace that as, yep, we're going to have to do our homework. We're going to have to do our research, and we're going to have to figure out if I'm applying to these 7 schools, what is, to your point, my best foot forward as it relates to testing, given what those 7 schools are asking for.
There are sort of 2 annoyingly consistent seminal decisions that families have to make as they go through their journey. And Rick and I have lots of feelings about both of these topics. 1, what test am I going to take? When am I going to take it? Am I going to prepare for it? How am I going to prepare for it? And then do I submit the scores? That's the first set of questions. And the second set of questions, that in many ways for many of you is equally maddening. Where am I applying early decision, if anywhere? Where am I applying early action? Where am I applying regular decision? Where am I applying early decision to? I mean, the list and permutations are endless, but each one of you needs to have a plan around those 2 things. And annoyingly, a lot of the testing dialogue is dictated by the early admission dialogue. They sort of cascade one to the other. And this is why it's so hard for someone like Rick to give a direct answer, because the number of different combinations is legion. So we kind of do the best we can. And you mentioned 7 colleges, and inherent to that is this notion that people are broadening their lists.
Right.
Speak to how people should broaden their list. You spoke earlier about creating optionality, but give a little more than that.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that the goal, again, is to end up with choices, meaning you're being admitted, but also choices meaning it's, financially affordable for your family. So I think ultimately what students want to do is they want to hone in on, who am I as a learner? What am I excited about? Who are the type of people, right, who bring out my best? What are the places? And sometimes it's easy to go about this the opposite direction. Where are the type of places that you don't resonate with? What are the type of places that you feel like aren't good kind of fits for you? Both closing doors and, really understanding resonance are the ways that you hone in on what am I looking for in a college. The good news, as you said earlier, I mean, conservatively, there's 2,800 four-year schools in the country. So if we're just talking about those and not 2 years and other options around America, you're going to easily be able to find a reasonable number of schools, and I would put a reasonable somewhere around 10 or so, that A, you can be admitted to, that B, you can afford to go to, and that C, you would be more than excited, to have the opportunity to engage with. Now, it's interesting because people will talk about this idea of you need, and they call them all kinds of different terms, but a safety school or a foundation school or, whatever you want to call it. And then they always go the opposite direction and say, you should also apply to some reach schools, like places that you're not so sure you'll be admitted. My question back to that is why? Why do you feel like you need to do that? If you can get excited about and be, really feel like you resonate with a bunch of schools that have 50 to 70% admit rates, I don't understand why you need to go also add on one that has below a 20% admit rate where it's less likely that you're going to be admitted. If, yeah.
You sort of spoke to the Holy Trinity. I want to come back to it.
Mhm.
What is a great college? Well, a lot of people immediately go to brands, the
Mhm.
Harvards and the Yales and things like that. But Rick
Yep.
just told you what a great college is. A great college checks three boxes. One, your child will be happy and successful there. Two, they will admit her. And three, you can afford to send him there. That is the Holy Trinity. And for some of you, that's called Georgia Tech. For other, it's West Georgia. For other,
Mhm.
it's the University of Georgia. It's different for everybody. Um, and then there's one other thing. It's probably the first thing Rick has said that I've actually disagreed with, and it's
All
probably
right.
just a personal peccadillo. I've never liked the terms reach and safety. They seem
Yeah.
pejorative and judgmental. Reach, as in somehow it is beyond you, and no one ever wakes up in the morning saying, "Woo, safe! I'm down for that," right?
Yeah.
I would look at this as a mathematical exercise. There are schools that are unlikely to take you.
Mhm.
There are schools that might possibly take you. There are
Yep.
schools that will probably take you, and there are schools that are likely to take you. And every single one of those schools that you pick in any category is one that you should be excited to go to, or it
Mhm.
doesn't belong on your list. So I sort of personally abandoned reach and safety
Yeah.
because I didn't like the connotation of them.
I
Um,
agree.
but that's it.
No, I agree. And other terms that can be used along with what you just described and likely and unlikely is predictable and unpredictable. When we talk about these quote unquote highly selective schools, that's just on the student side, that means it's unpredictable. They got a 9% admit rate. Very difficult to predict whether or not that's going to work out. I'll just say this about what makes a great school. I think it's funny. I have a 13-year-old daughter. And we were watching ESPN together last year, and she's stretching. Now, her stretching is like most people's contortion. So I should just say that her head is like her legs over her head, and she's sitting there looking at Sports Center, and all these different headlines are coming up, right? And they're talking about, Nebraska played Colorado, and BYU played University of Michigan, and all this stuff. And every school that comes up, she's like, "Is that a good school?" Right? Um, is that a good school? University of New Mexico, is that a good school? And every time she asked the question, I said yes. And I think, and so ultimately, what I really thought about, because a lot of students ask that understandable question, is that a good school? And I think the better question is that a good school for me? You know, is that a good school for me? All right, sure. They have a, really high SAT average, and a bunch of their graduates have gone on to be presidents and, you know, diplomats. But I hate being in the cold and I don't like cities. That is not a good school for me, right? I just think that adding that on is a helpful frame.
I'm about to ask a question that I don't particularly enjoy, but it's come up a bunch of times, so I think we're going to need to address it. We talk about school choice and school visits. Here's a weird pro tip. When you're on campus, take your kid to the dining hall or the Starbucks on campus and leave her there. Leave her there. You can't be there with her. I guarantee you, any kid who spends an hour hanging around college students while they're eating will know the culture of that college. They'll hear things that you probably don't want to hear as parents, but they'll come out of there knowing what that place looks and feels like.
Mhm.
Randomly, I learned that when I visited BYU, and
Okay.
everyone around me was talking about the ice cream social that night. And I was kind of going, well, that's very wholesome and certainly not for me. So
Hmm.
we got two or three different versions of this question.
Yep.
People are hung up on holistic
Okay.
because they're like, how do you read 60,000 essays? Or do you use bots to do it, AI?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
perhaps a little expansion across how colleges like yours
Hmm.
handle these volumes of essays in a way that sort of seems palatable.
Sure. I mean, the first thing you have to understand, the way I look at this is every school has a bowl. We're at the end of the day, enrollment managers and admission directors are just soup makers, right? The Georgia Tech Bowl happens to contain 3,900 ingredients in it, right? 3,900, whatever you want to call it. That's our class size goal. That's what we're going for. Ohio State, they don't even have a bowl. That's more like a vat or something. And then, Agnes Scott, which is down the street from us, a school of maybe 1,500 or something like that, has just a little saucer. You start by saying, what's our goal? How many students can we admit? And how many applications did we get, right? In a lot of cases, schools, Georgia Tech is a good example, and any public school is going to be like this. There is almost inevitably some direction given from a board, some direction given from a legislator, et cetera, that says a certain percentage of your bowl needs to be from your state. And so you can right away take any applicant that's from your state and set them aside as one group to review, and anybody who is not from your state and set them aside for review. And that's going to then dictate admit rates from there. If you're a private school, and even within public schools, this also happens, there are often targets by major. There are often targets by college. Even with your out-of-state group, you're not going to want to fill that entire last portion of your bowl with students from California or Texas or one other state. You're going to try to get your tomatoes and your carrots and your onions in there to make a full soup, be it academically, be it geographically, whatever it might be. And all of that plays into how you read and the competition and the rigor with which you read, right? So are all applications read? At Georgia Tech, yes, 100% of applications are read. Do some go a lot more quickly than others? Yes, on both sides. Some students are so clearly an admit, and it's just an obvious, easy read. It's one and done, and you're through. Conversely, there's some students who are just, for whatever reason, not competitive, not a good fit, and that's a very quick read. We spend most of our time in the middle, thinking about, okay, we've been able to eliminate on either side. Now we're going to kind of work here, and we're going to try to work for those, what we would call institutional priorities, and try to ensure that who we're admitting is filling the bowl with the type of students to round out that class. And so, we do that through committees, we do that with faculty. It is a protracted process. And if you're a senior right now, you're in that unfortunate spot of having submitted applications and waiting for months. And that's what's happening behind the scenes.
One, robots do not read applications, right?
Correct.
Two, Rick just gave you an incredibly important piece of knowledge that kind of slid into the middle. I want you to imagine a giant iceberg. Now, you guys know with icebergs that you can only see 10% above the waterline. And so we as humans focus on that which we can see. And the 10% we can see are grades and test scores and extracurriculars and activities. So we hyper-focus there. But the 90% below the waterline are the institutional priorities. And you won't know what those priorities are because they're not always shared. I mean, Rick shared you one for Georgia. 60% of the kids are going to be from Georgia. But those institutional priorities drive so much. Now, one other data point for the people who've asked, how do they do holistic grading? UCLA had 150,000 applications last year. UCLA has hundreds of readers who they hire and train. And each reader traditionally gets a school or a district where all of the applicants from that district are read in their entirety and in many ways ranked by the reader. And that is then data that can flow to committee. So these schools have multiple ways to put humans who are well versed in this process and sort of give places legitimate reads. I've seen it done time and time again. This one, Rick, ignoring your personal political beliefs, what impact did the Supreme Court decision around affirmative action have on Georgia Tech, the way it evaluates applications, and if you could possibly speak to the universe writ large, because you speak about it in podcasts, speak to that, please.
Yeah. Well, the case that was against both Harvard and UNC that was decided summer before this one, essentially reversed 40 years of precedent that said, again, during that holistic review, which I mean, again, sort of be clear about the numbers. Most schools are using formulaic decisions, right? Most schools have more spaces and fewer applicants, and their admit rates aren't that high. And holistic review isn't part of it. We're just talking about a very small slice of American higher education. But in those cases, race was something we could see and something that the court had protected as usable as one of many factors. Just like I said earlier, residency can be used as one of many factors to make an admission decision. And so in the past, when a student would work on the common application, they would indicate what their race is. It would map over into our system. And when we opened up the application at one point during paper and then more recently, online, we would see that student's race. Now, if you have a senior or if you are a senior, you also see it on your side. You do indicate your race, and that is confusing for some people. But when we map it over, we redact that data point. And there's a lot of things students indicate on the application that we do not map into our reader. And by law now, we are not able to do that. So student indicates their race. We redact that from the data load. It does not come in. We can't see that when we read. And so for institutions around the country over the course of the last year, they just had to modify their data input and read blind to race just as much as they might have read blind to a student's religious affiliation in the past. And so that's essentially what it means to comply with the law, and that's the new normal. Now, in many parts around the country, this already was existing. In California, that was already true. Michigan, that was already true. In other places around the country too, but that's the new normal that we find ourselves in. And it has had an impact. I think if you look at some of the sites that are keeping up with the data that's coming out now in iPads and common data sets, you're seeing that many highly selective schools did have a slight decrease, or some had, to a greater extent, a decrease in the number of Black students, for instance, or Hispanic students in their first year class. Ed Reform Now is probably the site that comes to mind as the place that's done the best job of aggregating some of that data.
I would counsel that for people on this call where diversity is a compelling part of their personal journey, maybe that's ethnic, maybe that's having a learning difference, maybe that's an issue of faith, that belongs in an essay that you write. To the extent that it is definitely part of your journey, you want to do that, particularly in a universe where we're not really allowed to look at those factors as standalone. And in fact, one of the pieces has now come up 2 or 3 times, Rick. For Georgia Tech, and for schools like Georgia Tech, how do they do with kids who have learning differences? Are learning difference kids considered diverse? For kids who are on the autism spectrum, sort of a growing group, how do you regard those, particularly within the universe of STEM? Take it away.
Yeah, so I would say on the admission side, largely that is not going to be much of a consideration at all with us making admission decisions. Nothing changes with what we're reviewing and the expectations that we have for a student's ability to perform and show and demonstrate potential academically. And as I said earlier, sort of those 3 I's outside the classroom. The bigger question, and this goes back to, I believe Peter was the person earlier who had asked, what are some good questions to ask? This is what I'm talking about with what are your questions? Ask your questions. If you are somebody that is going to need or thrive most in a place that has certain types of supports, you should be looking hard into what that particular institution does to support students like you. And one of the things, here's back to your question from earlier about what do I hope people will hear from me. One of the big ones is there is a paranoia that is based, who knows, probably some dark interweb spot, that we're tracking everything that students are doing or students are asking. It really could not be further from the truth. When you're on our campus and you want to go and talk with people who are working with students like that have neurodiversity or have particular learning differences where they're going to need assistance, they are not tagging that in the system to say, hey, this kid just came by our our center and they're going to need extra support. So take that into consideration when you're making admission decisions. That is absolutely not happening. And my colleagues around the country will tell you the exact same thing. Your job, be it for a question like that or anything else, is to understand, is this a good place for me? Is this a good fit for me? Am I going to thrive there? Am I going to find my people there? And that, I think, more than anything, is what your job is in the process. Ask these questions.
Thank you. Natalie and company, could you put the podcast slide back up again? I had promised folks that we would do that. And we've had sort of 50 questions come through the chat box. I think we've answered 32 of them. I apologize for the 17 that we didn't get to. Yeah, slide 4 would be great. Thank you. And then, Rick, what's the last thing you want people to hear as you sort of go off into the Georgian night?
Well, for parents, what I call my sky banner message. So if I could rent out a plane to fly a message across the United States, the big thing I would want to tell parents is parents of high school students should talk to fewer parents of other high school students about college admission, and more parents of current college students and recent college grads. Because other parents of high school students are equally nervous and anxious, and frankly, they just lie and they embellish things and they only drive the anxiety up. They're not helpful. Talk to them about the upcoming party or the upcoming game or something else. But parents of current college students and parents of recent college grads always tell the same story, which is she wasn't even thinking about this place when she was a junior, and this is where she ended up, and we could not be more thrilled. Or, he did not get into his quote first choice or dream school, both terms I wish were banned. But and it just has worked out. He loves it. He's got a job lined up. He's dating a girl we like. They always tell the kids or cats type of stories, and I think that's really important. For students, I think my biggest hope, something that I hope that they kind of keep in mind is, control what you can control. And the bottom line is, like, what can you control? You can control the rooms that you go into every day. You can control how you engage in the classroom. You can control how you treat people in the living room. You can control, what it is you're doing on the field or in the gym or at your job, right? So you control what you can control. Be a good student and be engaged outside the classroom. Don't worry about the rooms 1,000 miles away or 200 miles away where my colleagues are sitting around looking at these things. Your job is simply to do your best work in the rooms you go into every day.
Love that analogy, because I love analogies. Natalie, before we turn it over to you, there is a follow-up poll here. We didn't get to all the questions, but if you have one that was unanswered, please feel free to pop it in here. And to answer the same question, and to echo something Rick said, for me, the last thing I want you to hear is the 2 deadliest words in this journey always begin with "I heard," because whatever follows that is pant-wettingly terrifying and almost always wrong. And with that sort of subtle guidance at the end, Natalie, the show is yours.
Well, thank you both for just a really informative and enlightening, and as always, inspiring hour. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we have them all. And if there are additional things that you want to know, please put those in the follow-up poll. And we'll do our best on the GuideWell team to send emails and try to answer as many of those as we can in the coming days. I just want to say thank you again to both Rick and Paul for your time and your wisdom and your expertise. It was delightful as always. I look forward to the next time.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Bye.